to our first presenter, Adele Hughes Evershed. Born in South Wales and now lives in Connecticut. She won the poem in the English language at the North American Festival of Wales in Philadelphia 2022. So welcome, Adele.
Hello, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I will start off by reading the poem that won the Eisteddfod. My poem was the English language poem, and the prompt was about, it had to be about bells. It's called In a Minute Now. I hear the chapel bells toll, and I am back, fastened to the sopping road by threads of rain, before seat belts in back and quick belts for cheek. My dad, a tip of a man, rubbed pink. Shirt sleeves rolled past his elbows, huffing and puffing about Sunday drivers. And Mam, no longer held up by her apron strings, dropping her head on the window to stare at Fern Hill, gently ebbing in farewell. In chapel, Dad would shake the storm of him away as he sang, rumbling like snow off a roof in a child's wish for Christmas. And outside he would give Mam a cwtch, as the bell rang as high as a heaven, promising a happy ever after. He'd say how he knew Mam was the one for him, because he'd heard the sweet bells of Aberdyfi. And Mam would roll her eyes and say, "They're soft you are." But she looked as pleased as the first daffodils in spring. So I let the space between the chimes of the time and tide bell hold me still. I hear Dad counting, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and he tells me how we'll be there in a minute now, as he walks me down the aisle. As I was telling my table, I don't speak Welsh, unfortunately. My dad did speak Welsh because his family was from Llanharan, but he never spoke it to us apart from the odd swear word. So I know those. The other thing I'm going to share with you is, if you were on the Zoom meeting last Sunday, we did a presentation about this book. It's called the A4 70. Poems for the Road, and it was an anthology put together by Jacqueline Press. They had a call out for Welsh poets to contribute a poem about the A4 70, and you could submit your poem in English or Welsh, and then the ones that were selected they translated. So I wrote in English, and Sian, who was one of the translators, translated it into Welsh. Last week she read it for me in Welsh. I was very lucky. I thought maybe if I really practiced I could read it, but as my friend Sarah just said, it's hard Welsh. So I agree, it's very hard Welsh. So I'm just going to read the English version. But if you are interested, this is a lovely book. There's 51 poems, I think, by various poets, and my poem is about the whole of the A4 70. But inside there are individual poems about, like, maybe a lay-by on the A4 70, or there's one about Pontypridd Museum, and you can get it on Amazon, so that's my plug. Okay, so my poem was called The Art of Embroidering a Road Through the Eye of Heaven. Not an anchor thread into the boiling Irish Sea. With the first stitch, go down and through the seam of hoary slate, and up and over Snowdonia. Fly stitch. Embroider back to go on. Zigging, zagging, past gossiping bridges, bone-bright chapels. Leave a delicate scarlet cross-stitch over Rosgoch. A needle point marking all the bloody outlaws. As you go, patch with other roads to keep you on the straight, narrow green. A herringbone for tea? Lovely every now and then. Later you can hem a kestrel cruelling overhead. With a stolid sheep, satin stitch. Honest, full, simple. Weave faster, buttonholing through Bithwells, quilt a blanket over Brecon. Tack a forest of stems filling the lushy twill, pantsing with charcoal and cockles. just over the bluffing mountain. Now you're running. In, out, couching with double thread, reaching the bullion knots of Cardiff. Gilt the castle, and at the end, rough Pearl Caroline Street. Chips and curry sauce, bang in. Know you have pulled your needles through the eye of heaven and made a tapestry of the wildest wild of Wales. I spoke to Sean, who translated it for me. I don't know whether you can see, but I've written it, I hoped, to look like an embroidery. I mean, that was my idea behind it. And then she was asking me things like, why buttonholing through Bith Wells? To be honest with you, it's because it sounds good with all the B's. And she was explaining, you know, how hard it is to translate poetry, because often words are chosen for the sound of them. And so finding, you know, the right nuance and the right word in Welsh is quite difficult. But I don't know, but it looks like everybody's told me she did a fabulous job, a banging job. Now, the call, you could submit 3 poems. That was the one that was selected, but I had written another one, which I've since sent off, and that was published by New Note Poetry last year. So I'm going to share that one with you now. It's called The Oldest Story That I Know. And this is a form of poetry called a bop, where it's in 3 stanzas and it has a refrain in the middle. The oldest story that I know. Joining the quarrying cars raging at the road most taken, passing postscripts to ancient battles, fought and lost and fought again. The borrowed parts of other roads are only there to ration the twists. And so my small country is poured in measures made huge. A land of giants. You can see them still, after leaving the dingly bow of the coalfields. There they are, lying buried in the black hills at the back of beyond. Tell the oldest story that you know, a road betrayed by bliss. Ahead, a timber lorry, stacked like a child's toy, lumbering, so I feel a dragging length of it as I count saints like stitches in my head. I imagine the squealing brakes, the hot gusting air, the rumble and grind of the gears are all just the incidental noise of dragons on the wing. And when my full English passenger asks for proof, I point out the Electra rugging the burnt earth of mountain ash, as all the light-headed Welsh before me have always done. And when finally my cockle town is in the rear view, I wonder if I'll miss the many types of rain. Tell the oldest story that you know, a road betrayed by bliss. Later, it was ever so easy to overlook the comforts of cow, or take a bop at the down-at-heel sheep. Always the sheep, planted almost daisy bright around Aberfan. I travel fast up faraway highways, strumming my hair like a harpy. But then I found that unclogged lanes were forever enough to unearth the drunken rib of the thing. It was ever humming in the thin red thread of my wrist, and now, like a winding house, it will haul me home to the woods. So I tell the oldest story that I know, a road betrayed by bliss. And I'm going to finish with a last poem that I wrote in after I heard Sean reading the first poem, the road embroidery one, in Welsh over Zoom. And this was printed by Cover Books. It's called Mother Tongue. The rhythm of the rain beats in her hips, and her bedgown ripples like a lake maiden's song. The tang of something fresh from the sea between her legs. Ewes run along the crest of her, ramming a tight ligature round your heart. And there it is, the ancient pull. It laps at the edge of now in a minute, or chops us in the oil and froth, waiting to evolve in a big gulp of achavi damodi when you cross the bridge, or when you're called lovely that first time in a long time. Sweat and tears and waves all taste the same. So the sensation when you look her is as elemental as the tilt of you hearing your poem read in Welsh by another voice. And it tips you back home again, dim on heed, just this.
presenter today, won the poem in the Welsh language at the North American Festival of Wales in Philadelphia 2022. He's with us on Zoom from Vermont, where he now lives and where he has a store. Hi Robert, can you hear us? Yes.
Yes.
So Robert now lives in Vermont and has a wonderful store there that he opened in his retirement, and it has a lot of Welsh goods in it. So welcome Robert, over to you.
Where in Vermont?
Where in Vermont? Oh, no sound.
Can you try talking?
Yeah, I'm talking. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Where in Vermont?
Where in Vermont?
Where in Vermont?
Sorry, where in Vermont?
Yeah, the store is in St. Johnsbury, and we live in the Northeast Kingdom.
North. Okay, thank you Robert, over to you.
Okay, are you guys ready? Okay, so the poem is titled Clachai Aberdoi, and Susan had asked me to give an explanation of it, or a version of it in English afterwards, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it in Welsh, and then we'll talk a bit about it after that, and then, I don't know if you guys wanted to ask questions or anything, what your full timeline is like. But here we go. Clachai Aberdoi. Ar drothwy penod hir olaf fy mywyd, Eisteddaf yn ansicr mewn bad rhwng tir a dŵr. Yn unig, yn aros i'r llanw fynd a fi I arfordir newydd. Ond mae fy'n nghefn i'r môr, yn lle wyneb a fi ddoe yn eiliad mwy rhag ofyn, a gobeithiau clywed unwaith eto, clychau hen bentref Clud. Mi ganna'r clychau sawl gwaith am minnau'n ifanc, yr hen bobl yn mentro ar ei ffyrdd yn llawn o fwriad, gwaith neu weddi'n galw, I dwylo'n llawn o bryder bob amser, i'r llais iain am nghannu geiriau tafod diarth, a'n farw erbyn hyn. Dim ond fi sy'n cofio eich chwelau, I straeon, i'ch chwerthin, a ciw melyn olaf wedi enwi I lenwi beddau. A dim ond ysbrydion y mae mewn hen bentref, a dim ond cofion mwy chwerw na felys. Mae glaswell a llwyni'n tagu rhesur beddau rwan, lle gynt plynus I gariad, a ffarwelio am plentyndod. Ond fel air y blynyddoedd hebio, I colli ddeuau'n haws os yn chwerw o hyd, Faeles I wedyn a chofio persawr I dillad, a blas ar ei bwyd. Yn dal yn y bad, wenaf unwaith ddiwethaf, a theimlo rhyr tonnau o danaf, a wedyn troaf yng nghefn am byth ar glychau Aberdoi. So, the title of the poem is a play on words, and sort of a play on some Welsh legends too, in a sense, but a lot of you probably know that Aber means the estuary of a river. Doi or Ddoi means yesterday, so it's the bells of a town called the estuary of the river of yesterday, so where yesterday ends and goes into the sea. And so the poetic voice is sitting there at the threshold of the last long chapter of their lives and sitting uncertainly in a boat between land and water, alone, the poetic voice says, waiting for the tide to take me to a new shore, but my back is to the sea. Instead, I face yesterday, or I face the village, metaphorically, for another moment, just in case, and hope to hear once again the bells of a cozy old village. Not sure how we would translate Clud exactly, but cozy old work. Mi gennai clychau'r sawl gwaith am minnau'n ifanc, so the bells used to ring often when I was young. The old people were going about their business, full of purpose, work or prayer calling, and their hands always full of worry. And their voices pronouncing words in a foreign language that is dead now. Only I remember their stories, their tales, their laughter, and then this line, "Acumulin olaf, wetien wilen we bedai." Acumulin olaf is an idiom in Welsh for the youngest child or the last child. So, the youngest child who has been nominated, named to fill in graves. There's only ghosts in an old village, only memories more bitter than sweet. Grass and bushes choke the graves now, where once I planted love and said farewell to my childhood. But as the years went by, losing them became easier, if still bitter. I forgot then what the fragrance of their clothes was like, what the taste of their food was like. Still, in the boat, I smile one last time and feel the roar of the waves below me. And then I turn my back forever on the bells of Aberdoe. And so that's the poem. Any questions?
Any questions for Robert? Thank you, Robert. That was awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today from Vermont.
Guys, hey, and I'm going to put a plug in. I bet Susan has already, but I'm the curriculum chair for Cymdeithas NAFOW. And we're going to be in Burlington this summer, so if you're thinking about studying Welsh or continuing on to study Welsh, we're not far. Who knows when we'll be back this close, so. Yeah.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you. Burek and Jessie Roberts. They're going to introduce themselves, and they are here to present a hidden history story from Wales of 3 women that came here with a petition. So this is their story.
So thank you all for coming today. My name is Jacqueline Burek. I am an assistant professor at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, but I'm also a member of the Washington, D.C. Welsh Association. So that's me and how I got involved in this project. Jessie, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then we will launch into our presentation today.
And I'm Jessie Roberts. I also live in Virginia. I do a lot of theater, and in goodness, it was not last Christmas, the Christmas before, I directed a child's Christmas in Wales, and I had help from the lovely Anne of the Washington, D.C. Welsh Society. And after she helped us with the Welsh in Child's Christmas, she told us the story of Heddwch Nain, and I was captivated, and that's why I'm here.
So we'd like to start out by thanking all of you, the Welsh Society of Western New England, for inviting us to speak today, and we'd like to thank especially Susan Davis-Sid for her wonderful hospitality. I think if we were members of your lovely society, we would have also voted for Susan to be president. So, but yes, and we'd also like to thank the other members of Heddwch Nain who we're representing today, especially Anne Griffith, who is our chair. And we'd also like to give a shout out to John Roberts in the back, and also to John West, who have helped provide us with some of the visuals for this afternoon's presentation. So we're here today to tell you about a remarkable, almost forgotten event in women's history, the peace appeal and petition sent by the women of Wales to the women of the United States in the early 1920s. But instead of presenting a typical history lecture where one person does all the talking, we've decided today to do something a little different. So we're going to be giving you the story of these inspiring events by mixing some lecturing about history from me with some dramatic readings from some of the documents that preserve that history, which is what Jessie is going to be providing today. So you're going to be hearing two different voices in this talk. Furthermore, our slides today will show photographs of the actual documents and people involved as much as possible. But when we don't have photographs, we'll also be sharing with you some images that evoke the kinds of people and places that these Welsh women would have encountered during their time in the United States. So our hope is that by hearing the story of these events, as our title suggests, in the words of Annie Hughes Griffiths, the leader of this movement, you'll be able to walk away from this lecture knowing a little bit more about the role of Welsh women in the peace movement of the 1920s and today. So I'm going to begin by setting the stage for the Welsh peace movement of the 1920s. So the First World War was a horrific experience for both soldiers and civilians alike. It resulted in millions of deaths and took a massive toll on the mental and physical well-being of survivors, whether they were fighting on the front lines or waiting at home for news of loved ones. After World War I, the peace movement was stronger than ever, and hope grew that the First World War might indeed be the war to end all wars. One key reason for this hope was the creation of the League of Nations in 1920, an international organization established to resolve conflicts between countries through diplomacy rather than war. But the League faced immediate skepticism and even suspicion, including in the United States, where isolationist sentiment had become extremely strong after World War I. Many Americans did not believe the United States should get tangled up in other nations' conflicts, either militarily or diplomatically. And several American politicians argued that taking a leading role in international affairs would distract attention from domestic concerns. But the lack of American involvement in the League of Nations raised fears across the globe that this fledgling international organization would lack the sufficient power to ensure world peace. And this is where the women of Wales get involved. After World War I, Wales was home to a vigorous peace movement, in large part due to the many women who joined the Welsh League of Nations Union and supported other efforts for peace. And you can see some of the evidence of the active role of women in the Welsh peace movement in the images on the screen. But our focus today is the peace appeal and petition mentioned here. In 1923, peace activists in Wales decided to draft a formal appeal written on behalf of Welsh women and addressed directly to the women of the United States, who had recently gained the right to vote. They hoped that, by speaking woman to woman, they might convince their sisters across the pond to push for the United States to join the League of Nations. Calling on long-standing ties between Wales and America, they wrote,
"We speak simply as the women of Wales, the daughters of a nation whose glory it has been to cherish no hatred towards any land or people, and whose desire is for the coming on earth of the reign of fellowship and goodwill. We long for the day when the affairs of nations shall be subject no longer to the verdict of the sword, and we feel that the dawn of the peace, which shall endure, would be hastened were it possible for America to take her place in the Council of the League of Nations."
These are moving words, and they reach their crescendo in the appeal's final sentences, which draw on President Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. As you listen to the appeal's conclusion, see if you can recognize the quotation from Lincoln's speech.
"The future is big with hope, if we, as the women of this generation, do our part. To us has come an opportunity as real as the responsibility is grave. We would therefore appeal to you, women of the United States of America, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, to aid in the effort to hand down to the generations which come after us the proud heritage of a wardless world."
This is an inspiring message, clearly intended to tug on the heartstrings of its American audience. And the Welsh peace activists did not stop there. To be even more persuasive, they decided to collect the signatures of as many Welsh women as possible on a massive petition, which would show just how strong and widespread Welsh women's desire for peace really was. To achieve this feat, they set up county and local organizing committees in towns and villages across Wales, and in Welsh communities outside of Wales, such as in London and Liverpool, comprised mostly of women, but also some men, who would arrange for the signatures to be collected and then pass them on to the Welsh League of Nations Union in Cardiff. And this is how Annie Hughes Griffiths, the woman in charge of the creation of the appeal and petition, described the process of gathering signatures.
I believe that this is the first time in history for a memorial to be organized from the women of one country to the women of another country. A word about the way this memorial has been organized. In its origin, it owes nothing to any political party or any political organization. It is a genuine, spontaneous movement of the people. The idea took shape at a conference of the Women of Wales held in Aberystwyth in May of last year. Soon afterwards, about 300 committees were set up, and hundreds of voluntary canvassers were at work going from house to house and from end to end of the Principality.
On the screen, you can see a piece of one of the leaflets used to acquire signatures and part of a page from the list of organizers. There were around 400 of these community organizers, and together they collected the signatures of almost 400,000 Welsh women on a petition some 7 miles long. It's hard to overstate just how impressive this effort was. Right, nowadays, if a social media post gets 400,000 likes, it's considered viral, right? But this is some 400,000 women in the 1920s signing their name with pen and ink to a petition on behalf of their whole nation pleading for peace. And Annie's description of the signatories is particularly moving.
There are, to the memorial, the signatures of all our well-known women. There are the signatures, too, of humble peasant women living in little villages in the Welsh hills. There are signatures of women of 90 years of age and over, one of a woman of 101, who were very anxious that the memorial should not be sent to America without their names. Our young university women of 18 years old have signed, and there is on the signature forms many a cross, signifying the mark of approval of those women who, in their youth, were denied the blessing of education. Also, the signatures of mothers who, in signing, remember their boys who fell in the war and now sleep quietly in the blood-drenched fields of France. And with each signature, many a tear.
As Annie says, the petition was signed not just by the rich and famous, but also by everyday women from all walks of life who found common ground in the desire for peace. The next step was delivering the appeal and petition to the women of the United States. The memorial appeal, crafted by Welsh artists, could be carried by hand, while the signatures on the petition were packed carefully in a specially built oak chest. Annie Hughes Griffiths and 2 other Welsh women were tasked with sailing to the United States to present these documents on behalf of the women of Wales. They arrived in New York in early 1924. With the help of prominent American women peace activists, such as Carrie Chapman Catt and Ruth Morgan, the delegates formally delivered the appeal and petition at a special luncheon held in New York City, in the presence of over 400 American women, representing 60 national women's clubs with memberships of over 16 million people. The 3 delegates then traveled to Washington, D.C., which is where this picture was taken, and they met with President Calvin Coolidge and Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes. Now, if you are a student of history, you'll know that these Welsh women were unable to persuade the United States to join the League of Nations. And as we all know, another world war would begin not even 2 decades later. Yet is this just a story of failure, of dashed hopes and missed opportunities for peace? We can't change the past, but we can learn from it. and Annie Hughes Griffiths, the particular focus of this talk, can help us do just that. She was born in 1873 in Llangeitho, Cardiganshire. Thanks to her family connections and her own activities, Annie was a fairly influential person in 1920s Wales. In particular, she served as chair of the Welsh League of Nations Union in 1923, and she was also the president of the union's Women's Committee. Because of her leadership roles in the Welsh League of Nations Union, she was one of the key people responsible for producing the peace appeal and petition, and she eventually led the women's delegation to the United States in 1924. And that's Annie standing tall in the middle of this picture. Now, each of the delegates chosen for this mission was remarkable in her own right. But our presentation today focuses on Annie because of the important role that she played in preserving the story of this peace appeal and petition. And that's because during her trip to North America, Annie documented all of her travels, carefully recording her impressions in a personal diary, which is now preserved in the National Library of Wales. Her diary is valuable for two reasons, right? So first, it gives us the historical evidence of the people that she met and the places she visited. But secondly, it also teaches us about who Annie was as a person and about how she viewed the project of world peace. For these reasons, the rest of our presentation today is going to focus on Annie's diary, using Annie's own words to tell the story of her journey across North America, from New York to California and back again. So we'll start out by getting to know Annie a little better. She was confident, yet humble, with a great sense of humor. And you can get a sense of Annie's personality from listening to her account in her diary of one particular incident, which took place when she and her companions were traveling by ship to New York City to deliver the peace appeal and petition. The passage that you're about to hear begins just where that black arrow is on the screen. So see if you can follow along as you listen to Annie's words.
Had service in first-class saloon. Lila McGain sang O Vraniau Gai Salam as a solo, and a few of us sang it over again as a chorus. After the service was over, a gentleman came and asked us if we were a Welsh choir on tour in the States. Very, very tickled at this, as our singing was truly atrocious.
Right. How very Welsh for everyone to break out into song during the church service, right? And if you look at the bottom of this page in her diary, you'll also learn a little bit more about how Annie passed the time on this long journey.
Ships run. It gets me giddy.
It seems our Annie spent some of her trip feeling a little seasick. And who among us can't relate to getting a little sick on a long trip? Still, she's not too proud to admit when she's under the weather. And it's scenes like these that help us realize just how open and frank Annie was. It's these qualities of Annie's that probably explain why, just after arriving in New York City, she noted her appreciation for American cultural norms by remarking,
My impressions of American women I have met today is that they are genuine and sincere in their efforts to give the movement all the support they can. Their reception of us was so spontaneous and so natural and without any of the side affectation of English women. They accepted us at our highest value as ambassadors of peace. They did not quiz and criticize us first and gradually thaw.
From passages like this, we can see that Annie was a go-getter, that she took her mission seriously, and that she enjoyed fighting for peace alongside other people, especially those that she found, to use her words, genuine and sincere. And indeed, Annie seems to have found her meetings with other similarly minded women, like the American peace activists you can see in this image, to be some of the most inspiring parts of her trip. I mentioned earlier that the peace appeal and petition were presented to the women of the United States at a luncheon in New York City, attended by many of the most important women in the American peace movement. We are very fortunate to have some of Annie's notes with pieces of the speech that she gave that day. So listen to how powerful her language is as she strives to convince her audience of the vital role that American women can play in a transnational peace movement. She makes that argument by explaining just how much effort the women of Wales had poured into the appeal and petition.
We are only the representatives of a small, but by no means unimportant part of the United Kingdom, a little country called Wales. The women of Wales number only 1 million or so, but we are determined. We call on the millions of American women to come to our rescue and our help. Your privilege and mine have been now to bring over in an oak chest the actual signature forms in response to universal desire of those who have signed. These signature forms cannot be handled without emotion. They tell their own tale. There are forms that are smudged with ink because they were taken from house to house in the rain. There are forms which are not so clear as we should like them to be because they were handled from door to door. And there are signature forms which the canvassers took out to lonely places where the signatures were obtained after a walk of 12 miles. Here is a force never really tried, the united will of women against war.
Annie also tells us just how inspiring the whole luncheon was, thanks to the powerful speeches given by some of the organizers, including Annie herself. But as always, Annie is too humble to assume that her words were the most important part of the event. Instead, her account focuses on describing the overall scene.
After luncheon, we had speeches. Miss Ruth Morgan introduced the delegation, and I then gave an address on the links that bind Wales and America together, and our act of memorial. It seemed to be appreciated. Then we three went up to the chest which had been placed on a dais, and padlocks were unlocked. And we gave up the padlocks and the memorial to Miss Ruth Morgan. And the chest was inspected, and the first question I was asked concerning it was, "Where's the signatures for Marion this year?" Miss Sue Harvard sang Land of the Harp and our national anthem, Land of Our Fathers. Thus ended one chapter in the history of the memorial. It was a truly thrilling gathering, and one in which our wildest flights of imagination we had never thought of on such a comprehensive scale.
Note how Annie mentions the luncheon included songs celebrating Wales's history and culture, right? So clearly this event was all about getting American women invested in Welsh women's unique vision of a transnational peace movement. And it sounds like Annie's presentation was a big success. As she tells us, her speech even prompted someone to ask about the signatures from a particular part of Wales, right? So no wonder that Annie called it a truly thrilling gathering. You can almost feel her awe at what women can achieve when working together in common cause. And you can get a sense of that awe and her Welshness from her description of her time in Washington, D.C. as well. She enjoys seeing all the sites that a tourist of today might visit, but she always notes down whenever there's a connection to Wales.
We passed the White House and Library of Congress, wonderful marble pillars of Baltimore marble brought there and put up by a Welshman, David Evans of Baltimore. Went to find Mr. David Roberts, the librarian in the fine arts section. David Bach, his Eisteddfod name. He showed us round and showed us many treasures. A copy of the Declaration of Independence, Lincoln's great speech in his own handwriting, portraits of the senators, the book stacks, which have 210 miles of shelving, and arrangements for sending the books to the readers, etc. Oh, a most magnificent building.
Annie was clearly struck by the sight of all these treasures, as she calls them. But no matter how impressed she was with the sights and sounds of Washington, D.C., she was not one to be overwhelmed in the presence of the famous or powerful. That sense of groundedness is clear from the matter-of-fact way that she describes the Welsh delegates' meeting with President Calvin Coolidge. As you listen to her account, see if you can get a sense of her attitude towards politicians like Coolidge.
The president's secretary opened the door leading into the room where Mr. Coolidge stood standing, awaiting our arrival, and we were introduced to him by Mrs. Morgan. He said words to this effect: "You are from Wales." I said, yes. He said, I have 2 Welshmen in my cabinet, Mr. Hughes and Mr. Davies. I said, yes. He then said, and I have Welsh blood in my veins, having for an ancestor Nathaniel Davies, so you can't get away from home. And I said, we are proud to own you as a kinsman. He said, thank you, I am very glad to see you. I produced a copy of the memorial and showing it to him together with photographs of the oak chest and said to him, this is the copy of the memorial we have brought over from Women of Wales to Women of America and the chest containing the signatures, etc. We hope you will allow the chest to be placed in the Smithsonian Institute for all time. He said, I will do what I can to help you. I do not see what reason there is for it not to be placed there. I was president of the Institute, etc., etc.
Note Annie's tone here, right? She's not starry-eyed at all. Instead, she's simply recording her impressions of the conversation. It seems like the meeting was pleasant enough, though it also sounds a bit like it was riddled with the polite engagement that politicians often show to voters when, faced with petitions concerning the issues of the day. Still, the delegates' meeting with Coolidge certainly went better than their meeting with Charles Evans Hughes, the Secretary of State, as Annie also makes clear in her diary. Her account of that meeting is much shorter and proceeds as follows.
Then at 2 p.m. we called round to see Mr. Secretary Hughes. He came out of his room to see and welcome us. Smug is the word to describe him. He was pleasant, but condescending and had very little to say to us.
Annie's account of her time in Washington, D.C. tells us a few important things, especially in comparison with her description of the luncheon in New York City. We can see that Annie is most inspired when working together with people to achieve a worthy cause. She finds the architecture and the historical artifacts of Washington, D.C. stirring, but they're no match for the electric atmosphere of that luncheon. And at the same time, Annie is not awed when in the presence of powerful people. Her description of the luncheon practically vibrates with energy, while her descriptions of her meetings with Coolidge and Hughes are less excited and focused more on recording these politicians' reactions to her words. But we have to remember that this petition was directed from the women of Wales to the women of the United States. Coolidge and Hughes, although they were powerful men, were not her primary audience. It's funny to think that, meeting the President and the Secretary of State is not the most important part of the trip, but it just goes to show you that this appeal and petition was, in many ways, the product of a grassroots movement, and that it aimed to spur similar energy among the women of the United States. Right? Annie's more interested in collective action than political clout. And we get a similar sense about Annie from reading about her interactions with everyday people. She met many Americans during the train trip she took across America after the official work of the delegation had been completed. First, she traveled by train to Chicago, then across the Midwest, visiting some of the big cities in California, and then she took in some of North America's natural wonders, such as the Grand Canyon and Niagara Falls, before heading down to Utica and finally returning to New York City. Along the way, Annie seized opportunities to spread the message of peace, and she recorded it all in her diary with the same frankness and wit she used when chronicling her time in New York City and Washington, D.C. On the train to Chicago, for example, Annie met a Mrs. Mina Kerr, the dean of Milwaukee Downer College, who invited her to attend a conference of the deans of women's colleges later that week in Chicago. Annie attended, but she wrote that she did not enjoy herself very much.
Got to the second floor of the Blackstone Hotel, where there were guests. About 400 women were assembled. And got into the most awful babble of voices it has ever been my lot to hear. Was introduced to several ladies, but never caught the name of one, as the noise was so great.
I'm sure we have all experienced meetings or conventions like this where the noise makes it impossible to actually hear anything or connect with anyone. And once again, we can see that what Annie appreciates most is working effectively with others. And since she didn't get to do that here, she didn't enjoy the conference very much. But she did enjoy seeing the unique beauty of the American landscape, just like she enjoyed seeing the architecture of Washington, D.C. and the treasures stored in the Library of Congress. For example, she gives a vivid image of the American Midwest in the 1920s, full of roaring, full of colors and other kinds of details.
During the night, we passed through the states of Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, touching a corner of Colorado at Julesburg, back to Nebraska, crossed the Missouri River into Omaha. The country we passed through today is one large tract of grazing land, with homesteads pitched at long distances from one another, and then in groups. Large herds of red cattle and red-brown hogs, brown chickens, artesian wells everywhere, telephone wires everywhere. The ground a light brown color, not a trace of green anywhere. Saw a removing of furniture on the road. 5 large carts crowded with all sorts of furniture, drawn by a pair of strong horses. Ford cars everywhere, in every shape and form, clean and dirty, everywhere.
Red cattle and brown chickens, furniture and Ford cars. Annie's not interested just in the tourist sites, but also in regular life in the American Midwest during the Roaring '20s. And she also pays a lot of attention to the way that American cities fit into the natural landscape. For instance, she says that Salt Lake City appeared
beneath the clearly cut snow-clad mountains, like white icing, so smooth and straight in appearance. A fine mist rising from the lake in the distance was a most impressive picture.
Annie wrote about the landscape in California in similarly beautiful terms, again with lots of attention to the remarkable colors.
Found ourselves in California. The hills, the Nevada range, covered with snow, a most beautiful sight. The white hill, the green fir trees rising in tier upon tier from the valleys up to the horizon. Well, the scenery changed rapidly, soon leaving the snow-covered hills as we came down to the valleys. Soon, I caught sight of an almond tree in blossom outside a tiny house called Cape Horn, most gorgeous pink. Then more and more blossoms appeared, some prune, and cherry, and apple.
Annie's descriptions of the American landscape point, I think, to her intellectual curiosity and her willingness to explore the world around her. Small wonder, then, that when in big cities like San Francisco, Annie also made sure to sample a wide range of delights. She records that she went
out about 10 p.m. for a walk through Chinatown and walked through some of the Chinese shops and admired their goods. Back to Ellis Street to a cafe and had waffles and maple syrup. All of us, tout ensemble.
Similarly, Annie recorded in her diary that when she was in Los Angeles, she ate at a Chinese restaurant and a Russian cafeteria. So it's details like these, the waffles and maple syrup in San Francisco, the Ford cars in Nebraska, the blossoms in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Right? They show that Annie was a keen observer of human nature and also of the way that humans interact with their environment. And who knows, maybe it's these traits of hers that contributed to her passion for the peace movement. After all, peace is only possible when humans show genuine understanding towards each other. And we can see that Annie is genuinely interested in learning about other people and how they live. And we see that side of her personality in her account of her trip to the Grand Canyon, too. So when she gets there, she and her traveling companion
booked seats for motor trips, one round Hermit Rim and another after lunch in the other direction. The Grand Canyon is beyond description in formation, color, and effect. We then went over to Hopi House, the Indian Center. Saw the Indians dance and shook hands with the chief, who had a university training.
Annie's sense of adventure comes out even more, though, from her description of her trip to Niagara Falls. She visited all the local souvenir shops, put on her waterproof gear, and went climbing around the icy tunnels of Niagara Falls, all of which she describes in her diary in her typical self-effacing way.
We got over to this great steel arch bridge to Canada and onto Table Rock, where we got off and went into the stores where there were various things for sale, made of spar and leather, etc. We decided to go down to see the falls from inside, so we donned oilskins, sou'westers, and rubber Napoleons and set forth. Going into an elevator, we went down, down into the bowels of the earth and came eventually to a spot where we got out and where a tunnel had been cut through the rocks and had several peaks of the falls from within and behind, so to speak. Large parts of the water was frozen, and the tunnel was lined and beautifully decorated with icicles, many of them yards long. I tumbled, nothing new, on the ice and slipped many yards, but our valiant escort rescued me and I soon found my feet again. We retraced our steps and then got back to the top safely.
These kinds of human interest anecdotes show just how curious and adventurous Annie was, right? She was definitely the kind of person to seize the day. But, while it's fun to read about her visits to these iconic American tourist sites, it's important to remember that Annie was a woman quite literally on a mission, and she applied her sense of adventure to her work for the cause of peace. For that reason, she frequently found herself giving speeches at local events in order to spread her message. Annie's accounts of these gatherings again show that, for all her appreciation of the natural world, she enjoyed nothing more than working for peace alongside other women. For example, after her adventures in Niagara Falls, Annie visited Utica, New York, in what turned out to be a very busy trip. Listen to how large this gathering was.
I had our breakfast brought up to me and then got dressed by 10 a.m. Had to give an address for this luncheon, which was fixed for 12 o'clock. At 11 a.m., Mrs. John Evans, who had tried to arrange a Welsh tea party, called to the hotel to see me, and with her was Mrs. Professor Sam Evans. After discussing the matter, I arranged to meet the Welsh women at 10:30 the following morning at the Welsh schoolroom. At 12, we went down to the room where luncheon was served, and where we found a company of 450 to 500 people assembled, including a large number of men. The lunch had been arranged by the St. David's Women's Club, and they had invited representatives of the 10 other women's clubs in the city. And these 10 clubs had representatives present at the speaker's table. Mrs. Hitchcock, president of the St. David's Club, after having a good meal, Mrs. Hitchcock spoke and introduced me. Then I spoke, and then greetings were extended to us from the different representatives present. A bouquet of sweet peas was given to Mrs. Thomas and me by the president of the Jewish Women's Club, who spoke afterwards.
What's really compelling about this meeting, I think, is the way that it brought together so many different people from across Utica, right? It's not just the women at the St. David's Club who are coming to see Annie. This meeting involved representatives from women's groups from across the city. And it seemed to go well, judging from the warm words with which Annie was greeted, as she also recorded in her diary.
Mr. Morris Williams and Mrs. Perry, president of Cymraeothion Society, spoke to us and all acclaimed of Wales and us for coming over with such a message and promised to do all they could towards promoting the ideals of world peace. They also sent greetings and promises and appreciation to the women of Wales. It was a very pleasant gathering, well managed and successfully arranged.
This luncheon would have been a powerful experience for everyone who attended, but that said, Annie's mission did not always proceed smoothly. Although the Utica events seemed to have been successful, there was some friction behind the scenes. In her diary, Annie noted that,
"We heard echoes of domestic misunderstanding and differences. One section sat on one side of the bench, another section on the other. Mrs. Hitchcock represented one element, Mrs. John Evans the other, and they did not blend. Oh, they were all very kind to us, but not quite so understanding towards each other."
what was the cause for this discord? We can only guess. but we can certainly imagine that it would not have been comforting to realize that even a luncheon arranged in support of world peace could become a source of conflict. Still, Annie's optimistic nature made sure that she did not dwell on these problems. She wrapped up her account of this stop on her journey by saying,
"We left Utica happy after receiving much kindness from the Welsh friends there."
And when she published this newspaper article on the screen soon after her return to London, Annie did not mention any of this discord in her account of the trip. She focused only on the positives. So it seems then that this internal tension was no match for the power of Annie's message of peace. And it also seems that Annie returned to Britain feeling proud of what the women of Wales had achieved. In addition to solidifying ties with American peace activists, meeting with politicians, and addressing thousands of people in various meetings across the country, the widespread newspaper coverage of the Welsh Women's Peace Appeal and petition broadcast Annie's voice both across the United States and abroad. As Annie wrote at the end of this newspaper article,
"We are still the three women representing the 400,000 women of Wales who put their signatures to the memorial, which has been so magnificently received by the women of America, and which has caused our American sisters to reiterate again and again their appreciation of our efforts and to assure us of their loyal and consistent cooperation in the cause of international friendship and world peace."
To conclude, we'd like to reflect for a moment on Annie Hughes Griffiths and her significance in Welsh, American, and even world history. Reading Annie's diary gives us a good sense of who Annie was. She was clearly a woman of great intelligence and perception who knew how to read a room. And she was also a very witty woman because her way of describing people and places makes her diary a very fun read. And furthermore, she appreciated the beauty of the natural world. And we see that in the way that she described everything from the Grand Canyon to the bouquets of flowers that she was often given at events. Right, all of these traits make her an excellent messenger of peace. But even more importantly, Annie was a woman in awe of what humans could achieve when they worked together for a just cause. It is Annie's energy, her willingness to take action, that had a lasting impact on the world. At the same time, Annie was humble. She recognized that she was just one woman in a much larger movement, and that world peace could only be attained if everyone worked together. And above all, she was a woman with strong moral courage who fought so that future generations could inherit a more peaceful world. Her example can inspire us to face today's challenges with honesty, open-mindedness, and optimism. So we're going to conclude our presentation with just one final quotation from Annie. Most of her writings concerning the peace appeal and petition are in English, but she did write one note in Welsh, which her granddaughter, Meg Ellis, has translated into English and has kindly agreed to share with us. And this is the quotation that's up on your screen. So I'll read the Welsh, and Jessie here is going to read the English translation for you. And for all you Welsh speakers in the room, dwi'n dysgu Cymraeg, ond mae'n bwysig iawn I glywed geiriau Annie, felly dwi'n mynd I drio. So, Ferched Cymru. Dyma gyfle I ni heddiw I wneud i'r hyn a allan, dros ein plant a rhai y ddaw ar ei hol. I adael iddynt, fel cynhysgaeth, gwlad a rhyfel wedi ei ddiwrseddu anddi. Gwlad lle mae cariad a llawenydd a phethau cyffelyb yn nodweddu ei phobl. Fel y gallant gydfiw, cydweithio a charaddoddi ar y cenhedloedd eraill, mewn heddwch, tangnefydd a chariad.
Women of Wales, here is an opportunity for us today to do what we can for our children and those who will come after us, to bequeath to them as a legacy a nation in which war has been deposed, a nation where love, joy, and similar features characterize her people, so that they may live together, work together, worship together, with other nations in peace, tranquility, and love.
And there are opportunities for us to work towards Annie's vision today. Over the last few years, several academic and cultural institutions have gotten together to form a partnership whose goal is to remember, celebrate, and fulfill Welsh women's vision of peace. And as you can see from this list of organizations, the group that Jessie and I are here to represent, and that Susan and Annie are also a part of, is Heddwch Nain Mamgu Gogledd America, or Our Grandmother's Peace North America. But we're just one tiny part of a much larger movement. We've been delighted to share some of the history of this peace appeal and petition with you today, and we're excited to see what the future will bring. To which part, we'd love to have you explore that future with us if you're so inclined. There's lots of different ways that you can get involved. So perhaps you're a member of a women's organization that you think would enjoy hearing a presentation like this. We'd be happy to come visit in person or over Zoom, right? Or maybe you're curious to know maybe one of your relatives signed the petition, right? Or maybe you once stayed in one of the houses that one of the organizers lived in, right? We'd love to hear your story if that's the case. We can help you, look to see if on the list of organizers, if you recognize any names or addresses. So if you have any questions or ideas or are interested in getting involved in some fashion, we'd love to hear from you. We rely on the diverse talents of our various members. We have left flyers on your tables as well, or brochures I should say, on your tables as well. I think all tables have a few in English and at least one in Welsh. We have spares if we need. But please do get in touch with us. They're the red ones that say Heddwch Nain. I think they're underneath the red for the people at this table, sorry. But thank you so much again for hearing our presentation today, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
It's way somewhere for
We
transportation to somewhere?
There is always a rumor going around about that. We all know how rumors work. So there are discussions about what is going to happen, but nothing has been set for certain. But as soon as we hear, we will be happy to spread that news with authority.
So it is in the Smithsonian?
The chest is in the Smithsonian, yes. This is how actually all of us kind of got involved. Is the chair of our organization, Anne Griffith, who is not here today, but she actually saw the chest in the Smithsonian. She was one of the people who found it, and so it's an amazing story, and I hope. If you attended Susan's presentation on Zoom a few weeks ago, you heard Anne talk about that, but I think you can probably send the link to, I think that was recorded as well. So, but yeah, so it is in the Smithsonian. We don't know if that will always be the case or not, but that is where it is now, and it is being well cared for, so that way eventually it can be used for research purposes.
I think you could say what we would like to happen to it.
I think we would like it to go to Wales because the hope is that the petition itself could be digitized. So the list of community organizers, that is available already online, so that is searchable. But that 7 miles long petition, that is not yet searchable, right? It's just the hard copy papers, but that kind of thing needs proper historic conservation. So the hope is that it would eventually be digitized, so that way it can be searchable for people, but that kind of thing takes a lot of money. Yeah.
Is there a list available of people who went to the Utica Luncheon? My wife's relatives live in Utica.
See, so we have been working with some of the people in Utica to see if we can get some people on the ground to do more of that on the ground research, right? Like this is one of those things where we would love to have people, so if she knows people in Utica and can get them to sort of send things to us, that would be great. So we don't have that right now, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist out there somewhere. It could be that the Utica Welsh Society has that record in some archive somewhere. We aren't certain. We do have some research funding to go visit the house of one of the other women who were one of the delegates here, so not Annie Hughes Griffiths, but we're going to, hopefully this summer, go to her summer cottage, which apparently has a bunch of documents in the attic, and wouldn't it be lovely if some of those documents were related to this? So I guess the best answer I can give you is that research is ongoing, but this is one of the things that we would love is that if people have connections to these various places, we'd love to get in touch and work with you.
The lady, one of the ladies who has this summer cottage in Massachusetts, her family live in San Francisco right now, and I got to meet them, and I met her son and the grandchildren, and we've also met Annie's granddaughter also. So it's been quite a journey, and it's been really, really wonderful. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
So was Charles Hughes, the Secretary of State, was he against joining the League of Nations?
No, actually he was a big supporter of the peace movement. Actually Jesse and I were talking about this earlier. He was one of the people responsible for disarmament treaties and things like that, trying to sort of build those kinds of more peaceful connections. He had suffered some personal losses in the period before this, so we kind of think that perhaps he was just not in a good mood that day. So we would like to give him a more generous reading than Annie herself did when she called him smug and condescending. but he, it would be remiss of me to not say that he was actually. I think that picture is actually him. Scroll. That's him working with a bunch of people from various nations, so other sort of secretaries of state, or his, peers,
And the president before Coolidge, who was very close with Annie and the ladies, was
Woodrow Wilson.
Thank you, Woodrow Wilson. And he had stepped down from being president, and Coolidge had taken over before the ladies got to America. And actually, Woodrow Wilson had died about 20 days before they got there. And he was the one who was very supportive of the League of Nations. And ladies were very disappointed not to have met him and have him involved in the peace movement.
It's politics.
I just want to comment on the wonderful photographic work you did. I saw you used Ansel Adams' piece from MoMA for the Rockies. I mean, you just pulled in so much.
Well, yeah, I mean, we tried to use as much as possible, but we had some help finding some good images from other people. But yeah, it's just try to evoke some of it. But we wish we had more actual photographs, but. It wasn't the time when people had iPhones to take pictures of things. But one could only imagine what that would have been. But thank you, I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.